This is the Music Halls of Fame podcast. This week we switch up our format a little bit to talk about one important band and one important moment in time. February 7th through 9th, 1964, when Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees the Beatles made their first visit to America. Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles. Before we get going with the podcast, like everyone tells you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll know when these podcast episodes drop, which is usually every Thursday. Now, on to this week's episode. The year was 2001. America, while not in a state of innocence, still thought themselves untouchable to a major international terrorist attack. That changed on the morning of September 11th. What started out that day as primary election day in New York City, along with the announcement of Michael Jordan returning to the NBA, became a multi-city airplane attack. After that day, the country was in mourning and in pain. What helped to begin the healing process, especially in New York City where almost 3,000 people were killed in the attacks, was a baseball World Series matchup only a month later between the New York Yankees and the Arizona Diamondbacks. During those epic 7 games, with Arizona winning the series on a last at-bat, the city and the nation began the healing process. What does this all have to do with the events of the week of February 5th through the 11th in 1964? Just this. Sometimes, in order for a nation to begin to heal from a shared traumatic event, it takes pop culture and sports to distract the country from its problems, if only for a night, or in this case, a week. In order to understand how monumental that week in February 1964 was, you have to understand the mindset of the country at that time. Flashback to only a few months earlier. In November of 1963, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was beginning to be in a bit of a funk. His re-election bid was still a ways off, but he was beginning to lay the groundwork for it. He had started off the year with a 76% approval rating and a 13% disapproval rating, but by November 1963, those numbers were going in absolutely the wrong direction. Some of it was due to racial tensions and his handling of the civil rights crisis in the South. Vietnam, remember, at that time was barely a blip on the radar since America was only sending, quote, military advisors, end quote, back in those days. Anyway, by November 1963, his approval ratings had slipped from 76% to 58%, while his disapproval ratings had leapt up from 13% to 30%. Add to that, there were problems in the state of Texas. Texas was a state that he barely won in the 1960 election. Plus, there was a lot of infighting in the Democratic Party in the state. He decided to do a quick campaign swing through Texas. He wanted to help start his re-election campaign there, raise money for the Democratic Party, and to help end the squabble within the state party. On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy started out by speaking at a breakfast meeting in Fort Worth, Texas. From there, he flew to Dallas, Texas, where he was supposed to speak at a luncheon at the Trade Mart, then fly that afternoon to Austin, Texas for a fundraising dinner that evening. The president landed in Dallas, where he was met by a large crowd at Love Field Airport. He then got into his convertible limo with his wife Jackie and the governor of Texas, John Connally, and his wife Nellie. As the motorcade made its way through Dallas, the crowd grew much bigger, slowing down the motorcade. The crowd on Houston Street was particularly big. However, they were going to turn onto Elm Street and go through Dealey Plaza, where the crowd was a little bit thinner. The car made the left turn off of Houston Street onto Elm Street. As it began going through Dealey Plaza, Nellie Connolly turned to President Kennedy and said, quote, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you," end quote. To which Kennedy said, quote, "No, you certainly can't," end quote. At that moment, just behind his right shoulder, a gun was pointed at him from an upper floor of the Texas School Book Depository. No, it was not anybody who is implicated in a conspiracy theory. It was the actual shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald fired 3 shots at the slow-moving limo. By the time the 3rd shot struck the president, the crowd of witnesses looked on in stunned, screaming disbelief. The motorcade sped up, got on the nearby freeway, and rushed to the hospital, but to no avail. The 3rd shot was the kill shot. Within an hour of the 1st shot, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Jr. was pronounced dead. The country went into a state of deep mourning, and it was going to take something big to break them out of their national state of grief. Little did almost anyone in America know that a music act that was just beginning to make a name for themselves overseas would help to begin to heal America, long before an overseas war later in the decade would help to rip the country apart at its seams. Across the pond, there were 4 lads from Liverpool, England. The Beatles had put out their first album in Europe earlier in 1963, then went touring through Europe to support it. As they toured, the crowds became bigger and bigger. Soon, what we now call Beatlemania started to form. Throngs of adoring fans, mainly females, started showing up at the concerts, and in the streets, and at their hotels, and at the airports. On Halloween 1963, the lads were coming back to Heathrow Airport in London from a trip to Sweden. They were met in the airport by a swarm of their usual fans, including over 100 reporters this time. By coincidence, also in the airport on that exact day was a man who would go on to play a very pivotal role in the Beatles getting their big break in America. Ed Sullivan had the #1 TV show in America in terms of variety shows. What Dick Clark was to pop music on daytime television, Ed Sullivan was to nighttime TV. His long-running Sunday night show broke Elvis Presley and helped turn him into a superstar. Ed witnessed the Beatles' mania at the airport and thought that it reminded him of Elvis. Ed got in touch with Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, and offered him a lot of money to do one performance on his show. Brian, however, being the ever-clever one, had a better idea. He knew that the Beatles had conquered Europe. What he really wanted to do was to conquer America. He made a deal with Sullivan where the band would do multiple appearances and also do a quick tour of the United States at the same time. The PR machine got to work. Capitol Records, who were supposed to be their American distributor, had originally refused to release their album, stupidly believing that rock and roll in America was a fad and was actually dead. Indeed, at that point, rock and roll had actually given way to teen idols playing a sugar-coated version of pop music. Rock never died in England, though, which is what gave rise to the Beatles in Europe to begin with, so in a sense, Capitol Records was right, sort of, at least about American audiences. Even magazines and newspapers in the States considered the genre dead, wondering aloud and in print why a boy band from England, that they called them, was such a big deal. Didn't matter. This was different, so Capitol Records were initially dropped in favor of VJ Records. Capitol eventually worked out a deal to release the Beatles music later. The single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, was released in late December, playing first at WWDC Radio in Washington, D.C., then making its way to the other major cities. The song hit number 1 in January of 1964. 2 albums ended up being released that month, one by Capitol and the other by VJ, due to the deal that the Beatles had worked out with Capitol. There was an even bigger song, though, that helped to propel the band's run. The song She Loves You was written over 2 days during a stop in Newcastle upon Tyne. The band were on a triple bill with Roy Orbison and Jerry and the Pacemakers at that point. The song was originally loosely based on a Bobby Rydell song, but they scrapped that idea and kept one part of that song that seemed to work at the time, a part that was written in the third person. As John Lennon put it in an interview shortly before he passed away, the third person idea was Paul McCartney's idea because John would have written it about himself. John admired Paul for that. Oh, and yes, by the way, by then they had actually repaired their friendship and they were in contact and talking to each other, and no, they didn't hate each other until the end, as some people would have you believe. Anyway, the writing of She Loves You was completed, and on July 1st, 1963, they went to record it. Some people thought that there were too many, quote, Americanisms, end quote, in the lyrics. Plus, producer Sir George Martin thought the chord that George Harrison suggested they end the song on was bad, but it didn't matter. They did it anyway. Total days spent from recording to mixing the song? 4 days. It was that quick. In 1964, they re-recorded the song in German in order to please their German record label. The song was released in Great Britain on August 23, 1963, where it was a big hit right out of the gate. America was where it had its problems. First, there was the fact that Capitol Records weren't really trying to push them. The band found VJ Records, but that label had issues paying money, so the band licensed the song out to Swan Records on a 2-year agreement. The public and the critics' reaction to the song? Meh. Radio stations were less than gracious. One New York DJ put the song up against 4 other songs in a popularity contest one night. The song placed 3rd. Dick Clark gave it a spot on American Bandstand in his Rate a Record segment. She Loves You didn't do well there either, scoring in the low 70s out of 100. So, how did She Loves You end up being so big? Well, in a way, by the most trusted man in America. Before we get to the rest of the podcast, we'd like to tell you about our other podcast, the Music History Today podcast. Every day we tell you what happened on that date in music history, along with music releases, birthdays, and passings. So, if you like this podcast and want more music history, then please search the Music History Today podcast in audio or video form on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast from. For decades, CBS newscaster Walter Cronkite was considered the most trusted man in America. His no-nonsense, now that's the way it is, style made his broadcast the must-watch evening newscast every single night. Remember, kids, this was 1963. There was no internet, no Twitter, no Facebook, no TikTok, no YouTube, none of that. Everybody got their news from either the newspaper, radio, or evening news broadcasts. So those broadcasts were appointment television, and tens of millions of people watched them, especially since you couldn't actually videotape those broadcasts. If you missed it, you missed it. On November 22, 1963, the CBS Morning News ran a piece on the Beatles, with this song being played throughout much of the report. Cronkite thought that the response to the report was so good that he decided to run it again for his evening news broadcast. Unfortunately for the Beatles and for the world, destiny interfered when, just after noon that same day, that other story broke that would dominate the news for the next few weeks nonstop: the aforementioned assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The rebroadcast of the Beatles piece would have to wait, as every TV and radio station went to nonstop, literally nonstop coverage of the assassination and President Kennedy's funeral. The piece didn't have to wait too long, though. It ran on the very popular CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite broadcast on December 10th, 1963. By then, people needed something to distract them from their collective misery, and watching the hype of British Beatlemania did the trick. And hey, what was this catchy song that the broadcast kept playing in the background? The record label released I Want to Hold Your Hand rapidly in order to capitalize on the publicity. Soon, other Beatles songs were caught up in the wake of I Want to Hold Your Hand, including She Loves You. If hand was the horn of the Beatles' train in America, then She Loves You was the engine that pushed that train. I Want to Hold Your Hand started climbing the charts, but a funny thing happened. She Loves You stayed on the charts longer than most of the others and sold more copies than most of their other songs. In total, She Loves You sold over 5 million copies in America. Rolling Stone magazine considers it the 64th greatest song of all time. It's one of the top 100 best-selling 45 RPM records of all time in America. Plus, one of the lyrics, "Yeah, yeah, yeah," became a popular catchphrase back in the 1960s. To build on the popularity of I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You, and to hype the upcoming American visit, the public relations machine needed to make sure the band's arrival in New York City went well and was well publicized with a huge crowd to create what became known as Beatlemania in America. Many deals had been struck for fans who showed up at the airport to get free merch. Capitol Records gave out posters and car stickers, while another company announced that they were giving out a Beatles t-shirt and $1 bill. One radio DJ, Murray Kay of WINS Radio in New York City, announced the flight number and the time of the plane. Pan Am Flight 101, by the way. On February 7th, 1964, the Beatles were met at Heathrow Airport in London by 4,000 fans to see them off. All the band and their entourage knew was that a couple of their songs had done relatively well in America. They were under the impression that their reception would be much quieter than in Europe. They were wrong. Very, very wrong. Over 3,000 people met the band at Worldport Terminal at the former Idlewild Airport, which, as of December 24, 1963, had a new name, John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City. The band got off the plane, waved to the screaming fans, then went into the terminal to give their now famous press conference. The boys charmed the press by joking around with them concerning all and everything, from their haircuts to the city of Detroit, Michigan doing a Stamp Out the Beatles campaign. Seems some people in America didn't like the band. Then the band were whisked away to the Plaza Hotel on Fifth Avenue across from Central Park. And there they were greeted by hundreds more fans who had to be held back by a ton of police. They set up camp on the 12th floor of the hotel. Some of the people allowed to see them that day were the Ronettes, DJ Murray Kay of WINS Radio, BBC presenter Brian Matthews, who was doing an interview with them, and George Harrison's sister, who lived in the state of Illinois at that time, but flew into New York City to see him. That was day one. February 7th, 1964. The British invasion had barely just begun. On February 9th, 1964, at 8 p.m., a television viewer had a few choices on what to watch. For instance, on ABC television at 8 p.m., you could watch the travels of Jamie McFeeters, a Western starring Charles Deathwish Bronson, a then 12-year-old Kurt Russell, and members of the Osmond Brothers singing troupe. No, not Donnie and Marie. Little too young at that point and non-existent for at least one of them. You could follow that up at 8:30 with a show called Arrest and Trial, a cops and lawyers show starring Chuck the Rifleman Connors and Ben Gazzara. Think of it as Law and Order about 2 decades before that show came on the air. Over on NBC television, you could watch such family fare as The Wonderful World of Disney in color, followed by a show called Grindle, starring the very funny comedian Imogene Coca as a woman who worked for a temp agency who got jobs she was never qualified to do. That night's episode was called Dial G for Grindle. In the episode, Grindle was hired by a woman whose husband hired a gang leader to kill her. Hilarity and hijinks ensue. Wonder why that show only lasted a year. Sounds like a classic. Anyway, over on Fox, there was a test pattern. Fox didn't exist. In fact, back in 1964, you had extremely few choices as to what to watch. And that's if your rooftop antenna could pick up those channels to begin with. Although NBC had 2 shows that are now considered classics, Disney and Bonanza, which was on at 9 p.m., it was the CBS lineup that had the classic shows. Your night started with Mr. Ed, then went to Lassie, My Favorite Martian, The Judy Garland Show, Candid Camera, think of that as Punk'd before there was such a thing called Punk'd, What's My Line, and To Tell the Truth. At 8 p.m., though, especially on February 9th, 1964, you were more than likely tuned to one show, The Ed Sullivan Show. Ed's variety show really had variety. He had puppeteers, Broadway stars, singers, actors, and at one point, guys who sang standards, and of course, the usual teen idols. Remember, even before Ed broke Elvis Presley into the mainstream, rock was considered dead, so Ed didn't book a lot of rock acts around that time. Even Elvis was doing movies by then. The only thing anybody remembers about that particular night was that the Beatles were on for what seemed like an hour. They weren't. In fact, if you timed out their performances, they were actually on the show for less than 15 total minutes. There was renowned magician Fred Kapp, whose performance was blissfully pre-taped because they needed to do a set change between segments. Besides, if he had done his act live right after the Beatles, he would not have gotten through it. Hell, Ed even had trouble just introducing that segment with all the screaming girls still needing to be hosed down at that point. Also on the show that night were an acrobatic troupe called Wells and the Four Tays, and some kid who was singing a Broadway song. More on that kid later. At 8 p.m., Ed Sullivan had his usual show intro. He got out on stage. The crowd was already riled up, mainly women, teenage girls to be more precise. Ed first announced that Elvis Presley had sent a telegraph to the band wishing them luck with their small tour of America. Then, after a commercial break, Ed mentioned how excited the city of New York had been with the Beatles in town, then said his now famous intro, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles!" And history began to be made, although no one really knew it at the time. The band started with the song All My Loving, then went into Till There Was You. After that, they played She Loves You, which sent the audience into the stratosphere. The producer of the show cut between the band and the hyperventilating girls, your great-grandparents, I might add, if they ever bring up anything about how crazy you go for Bieber, Riri, BTS, or whoever's popular at this point. At one point during Till There Was You, When they put the band members' names up on the screen, there was a caption put under the one for John Lennon that said, "Sorry girls, he's taken," as he was married to Cynthia Lennon at the time. After She Loves You came the Fred Kapp segment. The band came back to play I Saw Her Standing There and I Want to Hold Your Hand. They went to shake Ed Sullivan's hand, waved to the crowd, and their part of the show was done. No interview. The poor acrobatic troupe had to do cleanup duty along with that singing kid. At the end of the show, the band would play the next 2 Sundays on the show, one of which, their third performance, was actually taped on February 9th at a different point in the day. In the meantime, the band went on a short tour of America. The significance of that night on February 9th, 1964, cannot be understated. First, it went a long way towards healing the nation after JFK's death, although the nation would be ripped to shreds a few years later by the Civil Rights Movement and the reactions to it. More assassinations, including President Kennedy's brother, then presidential candidate Robert Kennedy. Also, the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and, of course, the Vietnam War. Second, it reinvigorated rock and roll in America, because soon every record label had to have their own British rock band. The Kinks, the Rolling Stones, the Who, etc., all started the trek across the pond, and that became known as the British Invasion. After that, rock music became the most popular music in the country and was no longer a fad. Third, the Ed Sullivan Show that night set the record for the most watched broadcast in television history, with 73 million people watching, which was roughly 40% of the entire United States population at that time, because apparently some people actually wanted to watch Dial G for Grindel. That record, by the way, would be broken a few years later when the series finale of The Fugitive aired, when everybody found out who the one-armed man the fugitive had been chasing for the entire series episodes was actually. As for all of the players involved, the Beatles became arguably the most important group in music and pop culture history, and pretty much changed the game forever. As for Ed Sullivan, he had his legendary show for about another decade and was the go-to show for numerous musical artists through the 1960s, including the Doors and the Rolling Stones and the Supremes and the Jackson 5 and a host of others. Oh yeah, let's go back to that singing kid who was on the show that night. He sang the song I'd Do Anything from the Broadway musical Oliver, where he was performing as the Artful Dodger. Towards the end of the decade, that kid, then all grown up, auditioned for and got a role on a TV show about the madcap adventures of a band that acted a lot like the Beatles did in their music videos and movies. This group in the show would go on to have hits of their own, and the kid would become a teen idol in his own right. That show was the Monkees, and that kid who performed on the same Ed Sullivan Show with the Beatles and would later go on to imitate them as an adult on the Monkees TV show, Davy Jones, who, by the way, was also the reason why an artist named David Jones had to change his real name to the name he'd spend the rest of his career as, David Bowie. Funny how the world works. The days that changed the world forever. The Beatles landing in America on February 7th, 1964. The Beatles on the Ed Sullivan TV show on February 9th, 1964. Both, of course, done by the legendary guys John, Paul, George, and Ringo. The Fab Four, the Beatles, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, class of 1988. And that is it for this episode of the Music Halls of Fame podcast. For more podcast episodes, which drop every Thursday in audio and video form, then please like, subscribe, and click the notification bell on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio Podcasts, CastBox, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast from.